So let's now actually talk about the cardiovascular system as a whole and look a little bit at its gross anatomy. Now, the lungs basically occupy all of the space of the thoracic cavity, except the mediastinum, which is this area that's kind of in the middle here. You can see. There is within this area called the root. And the root is the site of vascular and bronchial attachment to the mediastinum. Vascular and bronchial attachment. Mediastinum. Sorry, my handwriting isn't the best. I've hurt my finger really bad. So it's going to be in this area right there. Now, if you look around the anterior, the lateral, and the posterior surface areas, you'll notice that there's actually a costal surface. And you'll notice here that it kind of shows you, and it's kind of shown from here and blown up, that you can see the intercostal muscles that'll help with that area. Now, the apex of the lungs are at the top here, right? And that's just the superior tip. And if you look at the bottom here, that's essentially the base of the lungs. And so that's inferior surface, and it actually rests on the diaphragm. And the diaphragm is essentially that muscle that's going to contract and relax to help us to breathe. Now, it's hard to see in here, but I'm trying to see in here. No, you can't really see. But in this lungs, farther down, there's what's known as a hilum. And I mentioned this earlier, right? And it's actually found on the mediastinal surface. And it's the site for entry and exit of blood vessels. So you're going to see kind of under, you can see where the blood vessels are coming in, but it's going to be kind of in that area. So you're going to get blood vessels, that's where your bronchi, lymphatic vessels, and nerves, that's all the entry sites, and it's on that kind of mediastinal area, but towards the back you can't really see it. Let me put blood vessels, continue. Finger is really starting to kill me here. Bronchi, lymphatic vessels, and nerves. Now, if we look, you have essentially the left lung that you can see that is, as we're looking at them, on our right side here, right? And so on here, you only have one subdivision, and that's the oblique fissure. And that's going to separate the top, which is the left superior, from the bottom, which is the left inferior lobe, right? And if you notice, this side is going to be a bit smaller because of the way that the heart underneath it is positioned. And then if you look, you have this other side here, which is the right. You can notice that there's actually two divisions here. And oblique, if you remember from muscles, and you looked at the oblique, they're kind of those side abdominal muscles that you're doing, or you were looking at. So it's, or the oblique plane when we looked at the cut meant sideways. Essentially, so that should help you with this. So those are going to be those kind of sideways fissures. Where horizontal, this is separating the two. So you have the right superior lobe right here, you have the right middle lobe, and then you have the right inferior lobe at the bottom. So that kind of gives us a quick overview into the essential thoracic cavity and the lungs. You can also see up here in the upper right hand, you can see the pleural cavity, it's parietal and visceral pleural cavity. And so the one that's closest to the lungs is the visceral. That's the one that's connected to the actual or close to the organ. And the pleural is going to be the one that helps to essentially that's connected and close to the rib cage. Now, each lobe is further divided into what are known as bronchopulmonary segments. There's 10 on the right and 8 to 10 on the left. They're separated by connective tissue septa, and each segment is served by its own artery, vein, and bronchus, right? And what's nice about this is if one of them is diseased, it can be individually removed, and you can still breathe. The lobules are the smallest subdivision that you can visibly see with the naked eye, and these are segments that are served, or hexagonal segments served by the bronchioles and their branches. And so you can kind of see these as we're looking at them, right? And so here they're kind of, these bronchial trees that we're looking at, right? You can come out here and you can see 1, 2, 3, each one. Or you have this, so you have 1, 2 here, and then you have 1, 2, and 3. But each one, do you see how they're color segmented there? So that'll kind of give you an idea of the differences that they can be further broken into. And if you look at these, you can see at the top S1, S2, and S3, and you can see that this comes out to red, which is here. This one is green, which is here. This one is blue, which is right here. And so these are the different subdivisions that you can actually get for each lobe. And the trees go into those kind of, what we were just talking about, those segments. And this just further gets you to see the different segments. So that right superior lobe is divided into 3 segments. The right middle is 2, and the right inferior is 5. And then essentially on the other side, you have 4 and 5. Now, lungs are perfused by basically 2 pulmonary circuits. You have the pulmonary circulation and you have the bronchial circulation. And so for pulmonary arteries, they actually deliver systematic venous blood from the heart to the lungs so that the blood can be oxygenated. So this is right. So we have systemic venous blood that's going from heart to lung, right? So that we can add oxygen to it. Let me put added. Now the pulmonary veins, essentially, and you can think artery 4 ways, right? So this is part of the pulmonary circulation because it's coming from the blood up to the lungs, right? And then the veins are going to come back with the actual oxygen. So this is coming from lungs to heart. And this is going to have O2, right, in it. So this guy is essentially coming from the respiratory zone. Remember that area in the alveolar area that essentially is where gas exchange is happening. This is a low pressure, high volume system. Right? There's not a lot of pressure there, but you're breathing in a lot of oxygen. Now, the bronchial circulation is essentially how the lung tissue itself stays healthy. So the bronchial arteries actually provide oxygen-rich blood to the lung tissues. And so this guy arises from the aorta and then enters the lung at the hilum. So this is part of what's known as a systemic circulation, right? The circulation that's providing oxygen to the body. So it supplies all lung tissue except the alveoli, right? The alveoli are already exposed to oxygen, so they don't need this delivery system. But all the other systems that are not, or essentially lung tissue that's not directly exposed to oxygen will need them. And then when we're talking, of course, pulmonary veins carry most of the venous blood back to the heart. So dash pulmonary veins, right? They carry, actually, carry back to the heart. Now, how are we able to actually breathe, or what causes us the ability to breathe? Well, it's innervated by the parasympathetic and sympathetic motor fibers. As well as visceral sensory fibers. And how this happens is the nerves actually enter through the pulmonary plexus. If you remember when we were talking about all the different plexi earlier, so they enter through the pulmonary plexus on the lung root. And so parasympathetic fibers cause bronchoconstriction. And a plexus is just a group, right, of like when we talk about plexi earlier, when we were going through the nervous system, it's a group of nerves. Constriction. And sympathetic allows for dilation. So that's essentially how we get the lungs to work through our nervous system. The pleura, which is just the last part, or one of the last parts that we're going to talk about before we actually talk about how the lungs work. The pleura is just that thin double layer serous membrane that divides the thoracic cavity into two pleural compartments and the mediastinum, right? If you remember the parietal, the parietal is the one that faces the thoracic wall, right? It's just superior the diaphragm around the heart and between the lungs. The visceral is the one that is on the lung surface, right? And then you have essentially pleural fluid, just like when we were talking about the pericardium, and you have that fluid between the two membranes for the heart to reduce the friction. You have that as well for the lungs, right? So it provides lubrication and surface tension that assists in the expansion and recoil of lungs. And so you can kind of see it on here a little bit. that here is, you can see this is that thoracic cavity, and you can see that lining right here, right? That essentially is going to be the pleural, the parietal pleural. If you look here, that's the visceral. And then that area between the two, that's where you're going to find the cavity and the fluid. And you're going to see that it's subdivided on both sides. Now, what's great about this, you can actually see that back area that we were talking about a little bit earlier, and the hilum, that's the root of the lungs that you can kind of see towards the back here when we're looking at the mediastinum and some of that connection that's in the back there. And you can see here that this lung over here is a slight bit smaller because you get more of that heart going into that side of the body, right? And so if you look, you have the, here you have the left bronchi, and then if you're looking at the veins and arteries themselves, you can see that left pulmonary artery here that's going down, and these are the pulmonary veins that are going back into, or into the heart there. So that kind of gives you an idea of what it looks like on the inside, or that transverse section of the thorax. So I'm going to go ahead and stop here again. And essentially, we are going to start the next one with part 2, which is respiratory physiology and the mechanisms of breathing.